this confirms the Trump administration's avowed strategy of going back to the Monroe Doctrine. It's about oil, it's about power, it's about dominance over the Western Hemisphere. I think it's diplomats around Latin America and around the world will be seeing this as a highly illegal operation, which violates in very basic ways the UN Charter and international law. So I think it confirms the fact that the United States, particularly under Trump, but not just under Trump, is not committed to upholding international law. That's the first lesson. And the second lesson is, of course, that this confirms the Trump administration's avowed strategy of going back to the Monroe Doctrine. We just saw President Trump publishing the national security strategy, which focuses very much on control over the Western Hemisphere. And so I think Latin American leaders are going to be focusing very much on this, right? The return to what the US calls the backyard, and the return significantly in a military way, right? It's about the US flexing military muscle in the context of the United States that's lost a lot of its economic might in the region. Most countries in Latin America, certainly in South America, have now closer trade ties with China than with the United States. So it's the US reacting to that relative loss, not absolute loss, but relative loss of economic power in military terms, right? By showing presence militarily. I think that's the main lessons that will be learned. I mean, in order to arrest, you had to invade, right? I mean, nobody, I think no specialist on international law is going to deny the fact that this was an illegal attack on a country and that it's an illegal abduction of a head of state. If the United States is going to abduct all the heads of state it disagrees with, and there are a few dictatorial heads of state it doesn't have significant disagreements with, then we're going to see a lot of attacks all over the place around the world. So I think there's no real dispute amongst the certainly the scholarly community and the diplomatic community that this was blatantly illegal. And you know, again, if the United States is going to act on every single dictator in the world, we're going to see a very violent place emerge from this situation. So 2 points here. I think it's quite remarkable that normally analysts like myself and others have to try and explain that this is all about resources, this is all about power, and not about democratization, which is usually the US leitmotif, right? The reason that's given formally to democratize, to do state building, nation building, and often we have to repeat, actually, it's about geopolitics, it's about power, it's about influence. Here we have the US administration and Donald Trump himself saying what it's really about. This is a really new development, right? It's about oil, it's about power, it's about dominance over the Western Hemisphere. That's the first point. The second point is that we do have inside the Trump administration, what I would call a neoconservative lobby led fundamentally by Marco Rubio, which is very interesting in regime change, in stark contrast with President Trump's electoral promises back in 2024, where he promised no more forever wars, no more regime change campaigns. Here we have a return to that agenda of regime change, and now as you said, very overt threats to a number of countries in Latin America. This is unbelievable behavior, right? The threat of the use of force, the threat of military intervention, of invasion against Mexico, against Colombia. This is a new development in Latin America. I think it may have short-term gains. To be able to parade Nicolas Maduro in New York is probably something that the Trump administration is very happy with right now for domestic audiences. But in terms of long-term relations with the hemisphere, Latin America, it may be really nefarious, I think, for the United States diplomacy abroad. Well, first I would say I'm not convinced that we are seeing regime change in Venezuela. I think that on the one hand, the US operation was very successful. On the other hand, it's also a certain sign of impotence, right? It's quite limited. Yes, they got the head of state. That's a big show of force, but they weren't able to install the pro-US opposition. We'll have to see exactly what happens with Delcy Rodriguez. I have my doubts that we're going to see a pro-US regime. Now, on your other points about the right-wing shift in Latin America, you're absolutely right. We'll have to see how long-lived that is, and certainly Trump has got allies in Latin America right now, Milei, the upcoming President Cast in Chile and others, Noboa in Ecuador, and Bukele in El Salvador and others. But we also have the two largest countries, which are over half Latin America's population, half Latin America's GDP, led by presidents who are still kind of very critical of this operation, namely Brazil and Mexico, who are on the left. And the left is still very much a real thing in Latin American political life. So again, we have to differentiate between short-term, medium-term, and long-term gains. And my intuition is that for the US, this is not a success story.